Private First Class James Morrison stood at the mouth of the cave, staring at 23 terrified women who would rather starve than accept his food. He had survived Guadalcanal, POW, and 82 days of hell on Okinawa. He had seen men die in ways that haunted his sleep. But nothing had prepared him for this, watching mothers shield their children from rice. June 18, 1945, 14:20 hours. Southern Okinawa, Japan. Morrison wiped sweat from his face, leaving a streak of coral dust across his cheek. The cave entrance gaped before him like a wound in the limestone hillside, dark and reeking of human waste, fear, and something else he couldn't quite name. Death, maybe, or the space just before it. Behind him, 3 other Marines from the 1st Division waited, rifles held low but ready. They had learned that lesson the hard way during the past 12 weeks. Caves meant danger. Caves meant Japanese soldiers waiting with grenades, ready to take Americans with them into whatever afterlife they believed in. Caves meant booby traps and desperate last stands and the kind of close-quarters horror that turned boys into old men overnight. But Corporal Henry Tanaka, the Nisei interpreter who had joined them an hour ago, had heard something different echoing from this particular cave. Not the sounds of soldiers preparing for a final charge. Not the metallic click of grenades being armed. Instead, he had heard children crying and women's voices low and rhythmic like prayers. Morrison had called out in English. Tanaka had called out in Japanese. They had waited. Slowly, shapes had emerged from the darkness. Not soldiers. Civilians. Women mostly, with children clinging to their legs or cradled against their chests. An elderly woman in the front, her face carved into deep lines by sun and suffering. A young mother who couldn't have been more than 17, holding an infant that barely moved. 23 women, 12 children. All of them looked at Morrison and his fellow Marines with eyes that held no hope of mercy. The Battle of Okinawa was entering its final brutal phase. 82 days of fighting had already claimed 12,000 American casualties. The Japanese 32nd Army had lost more than 100,000 soldiers. But the numbers that would haunt military historians for decades were still being tallied. Approximately 140,000 Okinawan civilians dead or dying. Some from artillery and aerial bombardment, some from disease and starvation, and some, Morrison had learned with growing horror, from their own hands. The propaganda had done its work too well. For 8 years, from 1937 to this moment in 1945, the Japanese imperial government had flooded its citizens with a singular message. Americans were demons. Not metaphorically, not as wartime rhetoric, but literally demons who would torture, rape, and murder every Japanese person they encountered. Women would suffer fates worse than death. Children would be killed for sport. Surrender meant dishonor so complete that ancestors would weep in shame for 7 generations. The elderly woman at the front of the cave spoke. Her voice carried the weight of someone who had already decided how this would end. Tanaka translated quietly. She says they will not be taken alive. She says they know what you do to Japanese women. She says they would rather die with honor than submit to American monsters. Morrison felt something twist in his chest. He was 22 years old. He had killed men in combat. He had watched his friends die. He had done things in the heat of battle that would live in his nightmares forever. But he had never, not once, thought of himself as a monster until he saw his reflection in these women's eyes. "Tell her we're not going to hurt anyone," Morrison said. "Tell her we have food and water. Tell her the children need medical attention." Tanaka translated. The elderly woman's expression didn't change. She spoke again, longer this time, and other women joined in. It sounded like a prayer or a chant. Tanaka's face went pale. They're saying goodbye to their ancestors. They're asking forgiveness from the Emperor. They think this is the end. Lieutenant Patterson, standing 20 yards back with the rest of the squad, called out, "Morrison, we don't have time for this. We've got 3 more caves to check before sunset. Mark it for the Civilian Affairs Unit and let's move." But Morrison couldn't move. He couldn't walk away from what he was seeing. These women weren't soldiers. They weren't fanatics charging at him with bamboo spears. They were mothers and daughters and grandmothers who had been poisoned by lies so thoroughly that they would rather watch their children die than accept help from the hand offering it. "Get me some rations," Morrison said. "C-rats, K-rats, whatever we've got." Sergeant William Cooper, a veteran of Guadalcanal who had seen more combat than most men could survive and stay sane, moved up beside Morrison. "What are you thinking, kid? They're starving, Sarge. Look at them. That baby hasn't moved in 5 minutes. We can't just leave them here. We also can't force them. They start screaming, we'll have every Japanese holdout in a mile radius thinking we're doing exactly what their propaganda said we'd do." Morrison knew Cooper was right. This wasn't just about saving these specific women and children. This was about the bigger picture, the strategic nightmare that kept commanders awake at night. Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the Japanese mainland, was scheduled for November. Intelligence estimates predicted anywhere from 1 to 4 million American casualties. And if civilians on Okinawa were this thoroughly indoctrinated, this completely convinced that surrender meant torture and death, what would the invasion force face when they landed on Kyushu and Honshu? The propaganda machine that had created the terror in these women's eyes had implications far beyond this single cave. Morrison understood the history behind what he was seeing, even if he didn't have all the details. Starting in 1937, when Japan had fully committed to its imperial expansion into China, the educational system had been militarized. Schools taught children that the emperor was divine, that Japan was destined to rule Asia, and that Western powers, particularly America, represented an existential threat not just to Japanese territory, but to Japanese existence itself. Posters had appeared in every city and village, depicting American soldiers as grotesque beasts with fangs and claws. Radio broadcasts featured dramatic reenactments of American atrocities, most of them fabricated or wildly exaggerated. Newspapers ran stories of American bombers deliberately targeting schools and hospitals, American soldiers collecting Japanese skulls as trophies, American intentions to enslave or exterminate the Japanese race. Some of it was based on kernels of truth, twisted beyond recognition. Yes, some American soldiers had taken Japanese skulls as war trophies, violations of military law that commanders tried to prevent but couldn't always stop. Yes, American bombing raids had killed civilians, though the targets were military and industrial facilities. But the propaganda had taken these fragments and built them into a comprehensive mythology of American evil that left no room for nuance or mercy. Okinawa had received special attention from the propaganda machine. As American forces approached the island in early 1945, the Japanese 32nd Army had distributed leaflets and made announcements warning civilians about the coming invasion. The warnings were explicit and designed to terrorize. American soldiers would rape every woman, torture prisoners for entertainment, kill children to prevent future resistance, and desecrate sacred sites to humiliate the Japanese spirit. The 32nd Army had gone further, distributing hand grenades to civilians and encouraging them to use these weapons on themselves rather than fall into American hands. Military officers had conducted ceremonies where civilians took blood oaths to die rather than surrender. Some areas had been designated for mass suicide, places where families could gather to kill themselves together when the Americans arrived. The caves where civilians hid became chambers of anticipated death. Families prepared for the end, not for survival. Morrison had heard stories from other units, whispered accounts that made him sick. On Saipan in July 1944, thousands of Japanese civilians had gathered at Marpi Point, a cliff overlooking the ocean, and jumped to their deaths rather than surrender to approaching American forces. Estimates ranged from 8 to 10,000 people. American soldiers and sailors had watched helplessly as families held hands and leaped, as mothers threw their children off the cliff before following them down, as elderly people jumped without hesitation. Some Marines had tried to stop the suicides. They had called out in broken Japanese, promising safety. They had physically grabbed people at the cliff edge. But the propaganda was stronger than their pleas. The civilians had looked at their would-be rescuers and seen only the monsters they had been taught to fear. Now Morrison stood at another cave, facing another group of civilians who had been fed the same lies, and he felt the weight of that history pressing down on him. Corporal Davies returned with an armful of rations, C rations and K rations, the standard combat food that had sustained American forces across the Pacific. The contents were simple but, by wartime standards, abundant. Canned meat, biscuits, powdered beverages, cigarettes, toilet paper, and can openers. Morrison sorted through the items, selecting specific foods. He wasn't thinking about nutrition. He was thinking about psychology, about what might bridge the gap between these women's terror and his genuine desire to help. He chose 5 items with deliberate care. White rice, The Marines had captured Japanese supply stores days earlier, finding bags of rice that American forces had no particular use for, but that represented the staple of every Japanese diet. Rice was familiar. Rice was safe. Rice was what these women had eaten their entire lives. Spam, canned pork product, introduced to U.S. military rations in 1941, and now ubiquitous across every theater of war. High in protein and fat, easy to prepare, despised by many American soldiers but nutritionally valuable. To Japanese civilians who rarely ate meat and whose Buddhist traditions often discouraged pork consumption, spam would be foreign and potentially suspicious. White bread, soft, wheat-based, sliced thin and wrapped in wax paper. Most rural Okinawans had never eaten bread. Their diet centered on rice, sweet potatoes, and vegetables. Bread represented American food culture as distinctly as rice represented Japanese. Canned peaches, a luxury item even for American soldiers, sweet and packed in heavy syrup. Children might find them appealing if fear could be overcome. The bright color and obvious fruit identity might seem less threatening than mysterious meat products. Powdered milk, critical for children's nutrition, especially infants who had been weaned due to their mother's malnutrition. Mixed with water, it could provide calories and protein to kids who were visibly wasting away. Morrison laid these items out on a flat rock near the cave entrance, within sight of the women but not so close as to seem threatening. Tanaka spoke in Japanese, explaining that the food was offered freely, that no one would be forced to take it, that it was not poisoned or trapped. The women's reactions were immediate and uniform. They pulled back further into the cave. Several turned their faces away, refusing to even look at the food. The elderly woman spoke sharply, and other voices joined hers in what sounded like protest or prayer. Tanaka's translation was quiet. They say they will not accept poison. They say they know what you're trying to do. They say they will die as Japanese, not as victims of American tricks. Morrison stared at the rice sitting in its bag on the stone. It was just rice. The same rice these women had eaten at every meal for their entire lives. It hadn't been altered or tampered with. It was simply food, offered to starving people, and they thought it was poison. He turned to look at the infant in the young mother's arms. The baby's skin had the gray pallor of severe dehydration. Its eyes were closed, its breathing shallow. That child would be dead by morning without intervention. The mother knew it. Morrison could see the knowledge in her face, the grief already settling into her features. But she held her baby away from the food, away from the Americans, away from the only chance of survival being offered. Jesus Christ, Corporal Davies muttered. They'd rather let their kids die than trust us. It's not about trust, Cooper said quietly. The sergeant had fought across the Pacific for 3 years, and Morrison heard something in his voice that went beyond exhaustion. They don't think we're offering them a choice between trust and distrust. They think we're offering them a choice between dying with honor and dying with shame after we torture them. From their perspective, refusing the food is the act of love. Morrison felt the full weight of that statement. These women weren't being stubborn or irrational within their own framework of understanding. They had been taught that Americans were monsters. They had been given grenades and told to use them. They had been informed by their own government, their own military, their own community leaders that surrender meant horrors worse than death. In their reality, refusing food from American soldiers wasn't condemning their children. It was protecting them from a fate worse than starvation. The propaganda had won. Completely. Absolutely. It had severed the connection between basic human survival instincts and the actions these women were taking. Lieutenant Patterson called out again. Morrison, we need to move. Mark the cave location and let's go. But Morrison couldn't move. He stood staring at the rice and the women and the dying infant. And something crystallized in his mind. This moment was bigger than this cave. This was the war in microcosm. Not the battles or the strategy or the political objectives, but the fundamental human catastrophe of what happened when propaganda completely replaced reality in people's minds. How do you fight an enemy who has convinced its own population that you're a demon? How do you win hearts and minds when people would rather die than accept your help? How do you build peace after war, when the psychological wounds go this deep? Morrison had no answers, but he had an idea. Sarge, we need to stay here. Cooper raised an eyebrow. Stay here? They think the food is poisoned, so we prove it's not. How do you prove a negative, kid? We eat it. In front of them. We take the same food we're offering them and we eat it ourselves. If we eat it and we're fine, maybe that breaks through the propaganda. Davies shook his head. You think that'll work? They've had years of this stuff pounded into their heads. You eating some rice isn't going to undo that. Maybe not, Morrison admitted. But what else are we going to do? Leave them here to die? Force them out and prove every piece of propaganda right? This is the only move I can see that doesn't make things worse. Cooper studied Morrison for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right. Patterson's not going to like it, but all right. We'll give it a try. The sergeant walked back to explain the situation to the lieutenant. Morrison could hear the argument from where he stood. Patterson's voice rising in frustration about wasted time and mission priorities and the reality that they couldn't save everyone. But eventually, Cooper's steady reasoning won out. They would stay. They would try. Morrison picked up the bag of rice. He had no cooking equipment beyond his helmet, but helmets had served as makeshift cooking vessels throughout the war. He scooped rice into the helmet, added water from his canteen, and built a small fire using dry brush and his lighter. The women watched from the cave, their expressions unreadable. While the rice cooked, Morrison opened a can of Spam. The salty, processed smell filled the air. He cut slices and laid them on a flat stone near the fire, letting them heat and sizzle. He tore open the wax paper around the bread, removed several slices, and set them out. He used his knife to open the can of peaches, the syrup catching sunlight as he tilted the can. He mixed powdered milk with water in his canteen cup, stirring until the white powder dissolved into something resembling actual milk. Tanaka spoke to the women again, explaining what Morrison was doing. The Americans were going to eat this food, the same food being offered to the civilians. No tricks, no substitutions. They would prove it was safe. The rice finished cooking, steaming in Morrison's helmet. He used his spoon to scoop out a portion, blowing on it to cool it enough to eat. Then, very deliberately, making sure the women could see every movement, he ate. The rice was plain, slightly scorched from the helmet cooking, but edible. Morrison chewed slowly, swallowed, took another bite. He ate half the helmet's worth of rice before setting it down and picking up a slice of Spam. The Spam was salty and fatty and tasted like every other meal he'd eaten for the past year. He chewed it, swallowed it, took another bite. He reached for bread, tearing a piece and eating it. Then peaches, the sweetness almost shocking after weeks of bland military rations. Then the powdered milk, which tasted like a pale imitation of actual milk but was wet and relatively nutritious. Morrison ate slowly, methodically, making a show of the act. Cooper joined him, then Davies, then Tanaka. 4 American soldiers sitting outside a cave, eating the same food they had offered to terrified civilians, trying to prove through the simplest possible demonstration that they were not the monsters the propaganda had described. Nothing happened. No one collapsed. No one showed signs of poisoning. The soldiers just sat and ate and waited. An hour passed. The sun moved across the sky. The women remained in the cave, watching. Morrison ate more rice. Cooper finished the Spam. Davies tried the peaches and made appreciative noises. Tanaka drank the powdered milk and offered commentary in Japanese about its taste, his tone deliberately light and casual. 2 hours. The infant in the young mother's arms had stopped moving entirely. Morrison wasn't sure if the child was still breathing. Other children in the cave looked listless, their eyes unfocused. The women's faces showed the gauntness of prolonged malnutrition. 3 hours. Morrison's stomach was uncomfortably full from eating more field rations than he normally consumed in an entire day, but he kept eating, kept demonstrating, kept trying to prove that this food, this simple act of eating, held no hidden dangers. The sun began its descent toward the horizon. Lieutenant Patterson had given them until sunset. After that, they would have to move regardless of the outcome. Command couldn't risk a squad staying in one position overnight when Japanese holdouts were still scattered throughout the area. 4 hours after the demonstration had begun, Morrison saw movement in the cave. The young mother with the dying infant shifted forward. Her movement was glacially slow, every muscle in her body trembling. She was fighting instincts and propaganda and everything she had been taught. Her face showed the agony of the decision she was making. She extended her hand. Her fingers shook so badly that Morrison could see the tremor from yards away. Morrison picked up a small amount of cooked rice, just a few grains pinched between his fingers. He held it out, not moving closer, letting her decide whether to take it. The woman's hand moved forward, stopped, moved again, stopped. Her eyes locked with Morrison's, searching for something, though he didn't know what. Evidence of the monster she'd been taught to fear, or hope that the monster might not exist. Her fingers touched the rice. She pulled back as if burned, then reached out again. This time she took the rice grains from Morrison's hand. She held the rice for what felt like minutes, studying it in her palm. She brought it close to her face, smelling it. She touched it to her lips, not eating yet, just feeling the texture. Then finally, she placed the rice on her tongue. She waited. Morrison waited. Everyone waited. Nothing happened. The rice was just rice. The woman's face crumpled. She took a handful of rice from the helmet, eating desperately, cramming it into her mouth with both hands. She chewed and swallowed and reached for more, her movements frantic with hunger finally unleashed. But she didn't feed herself first. After swallowing 2 handfuls, she took more rice and tried to feed her infant. The baby's mouth wouldn't open. The woman made a sound that transcended language, a mother's grief at understanding she had waited too long. The propaganda had killed her child as surely as any bullet. Tanaka moved forward quickly, kneeling beside the woman. He checked the infant, his face grave, then shook his head. The baby was gone. The woman clutched the small body to her chest and wept, rocking back and forth, her cries echoing from the cave walls. Morrison felt sick. They had been so close. If the woman had accepted the food an hour earlier, 2 hours earlier, that infant might have survived. The propaganda's hold had lasted just long enough to murder a child through maternal love, twisted into a weapon of self-destruction. But the young mother's acceptance of the food had broken the spell for others. Slowly, with varying degrees of hesitation, other women began to emerge from the cave. They came to the rice, the bread, the canned goods laid out on the stones. They took food with shaking hands, examined it, and began to eat. The elderly woman who had spoken so defiantly at the beginning was one of the last to accept food. Her face showed shame, not relief. In her framework of understanding, she had failed. She had broken her oath. She had accepted help from the enemy. That she and the children in her care would survive was, from her indoctrinated perspective, less important than the dishonor of the act. Morrison watched the women eat and felt no satisfaction. They had been shocked, yes, but not in the way he had expected when this day began. He had thought, naively, that if he offered food to starving people, they would accept it. The shock was supposed to come from food preferences, from discovering what items hungry people chose when given options. Instead, the shock came from understanding how completely propaganda could override the most basic human survival instincts. The shock came from watching women choose to let their children starve rather than accept help from demonized enemies. The shock came from the realization that an infant had died, not from lack of food, but from an excess of lies. The women chose white rice first, and most enthusiastically because it was familiar and culturally safe. They ate the rice with the desperation of people who had been starving while food sat yards away, refused by their own terrorized minds. White bread came second, surprisingly popular despite its foreignness, perhaps because its soft texture and mild taste seemed non-threatening. Children responded to the canned peaches, the sweetness appealing to young palates once fear had been overcome. Mothers mixed powdered milk for their children, prioritizing the young over themselves even in the midst of their own starvation. The spam was largely avoided. Cultural unfamiliarity with pork, the processed appearance of the meat, and lingering suspicion all combined to make it the least popular option. But the spam's rejection didn't matter. What mattered was that food was being eaten. Life was being sustained. The propaganda's hold was beginning to crack. Corporal Davies stood beside Morrison, watching the scene. They picked rice because it's what they know. Makes sense, I guess. That's not what shocked me, Morrison said quietly. What shocked you then? That they picked nothing for 4 hours. That they were so convinced we'd hurt them that they'd rather die. I thought the shock would be about food preferences. But it wasn't about food at all. Cooper joined them, his expression grim. This is going to be every cave, every village, every city if we invade the mainland. They've been taught to fear us so completely that surrender isn't an option in their minds. Not until we prove over and over that the propaganda was lying. Morrison looked at the dead infant in the young mother's arms. How many will die before we prove it enough times? No one had an answer. The next days and weeks saw this scene repeated across Okinawa with variations. The 1st Marine Division, Army units from the 7th and 96th Infantry Divisions, and civilian affairs personnel found tens of thousands of Okinawan civilians in caves, destroyed villages, and improvised shelters throughout the island. Approximately 140,000 civilians survived the battle, most of them displaced, traumatized, malnourished, and convinced they were about to be murdered by their American captors. The logistics of feeding this population became a massive challenge. Supply ships brought rice, canned goods, powdered milk, and medical supplies. Refugee camps were hastily established, though camp was perhaps too generous a term for the collections of tents and cleared areas where civilians were gathered for their own protection, and to prevent them from being caught in continuing combat operations. Navy corpsmen and Army medical personnel treated wounds, malnutrition, dysentery, and tropical diseases. The medical crisis was severe. Many civilians had been living in caves for weeks or months, drinking contaminated water, eating whatever could be foraged, and suffering from untreated injuries. Children showed the swollen bellies of kwashiorkor, the protein deficiency disease. Women bore bayonet wounds from Japanese soldiers who had forced them into military service or prevented them from surrendering. Slowly, word spread among the surviving civilian population that the Americans were not, in fact, the monsters propaganda had described. The evidence was irrefutable. American soldiers were providing food instead of poison, medical care instead of torture, shelter instead of execution. Children were being treated gently. Women were not being raped. Families were being kept together rather than separated for maximum suffering. The propaganda began to collapse under the weight of lived experience. But the collapse was neither complete nor universal. Some civilians still committed suicide even after encountering American kindness. So deeply ingrained was the shame of surrender. Elderly Okinawans, products of Meiji-era nationalism and decades of imperial propaganda, sometimes chose death over the dishonor of accepting enemy aid. The psychological damage would take not weeks or months but years and generations to fully heal. Morrison and his squad continued their sweep through southern Okinawa, finding more caves, more terrified civilians, more repetitions of the scene that had unfolded on June 18th. Each time the process was similar. Approach cautiously, establish that the cave held civilians rather than soldiers, offer food, face refusal based on propaganda-induced terror, demonstrate safety by eating the food themselves, wait for trust to slowly develop. Not every encounter ended with civilians accepting help. Some caves held only bodies, families who had killed themselves before American forces arrived. Some held civilians who attacked with bamboo spears or captured grenades, forcing tragic defensive responses. Some held people so traumatized by the battle's horrors that they could not be reached by any demonstration of kindness. But many encounters did end with civilians accepting food, accepting medical care, accepting the reality that contradicted everything they had been taught to believe. The broader implications of these cave encounters weighed heavily on American strategic planning. Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan, was scheduled to begin with Operation Olympic, the assault on Kyushu, in November 1945. Operation Coronet, the invasion of the Kanto Plain and Tokyo area, would follow in March 1946. Military planners estimated that American casualties could range from 1 to 4 million, with Japanese casualties, both military and civilian, potentially reaching into the tens of millions. Okinawa had provided a terrifying preview of what mainland invasion might entail. If civilians on a small island had been this thoroughly indoctrinated, this willing to die rather than surrender, what would happen when American forces landed on the home islands, where imperial propaganda would be even more intense? Would every city become a battleground? Would every civilian become a combatant? Would mothers armed with bamboo spears charge American tanks with babies strapped to their backs? The casualty projections were not abstractions. They were based on Okinawa's reality, multiplied across a much larger population on much larger islands, with much more difficult terrain, and much more fanatical devotion to the emperor. The propaganda that had nearly cost Morrison's encountered civilians their lives would be weaponized across an entire nation of 70 million people. Some historians would later argue that these projections influenced President Truman's decision to authorize the use of atomic weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. The atomic bombs were horrific in their immediate destructiveness, killing approximately 200,000 people. But the alternative, a ground invasion prosecuted against a population convinced that Americans were demons and surrender meant dishonor worse than death, might have resulted in casualties an order of magnitude higher on both sides. Morrison didn't know about the atomic bomb. That secret was held by a tiny number of people until the moment Fat Man and Little Boy fell from B-29 bomb bays. He only knew that he was tired of finding terrified civilians in caves, tired of watching propaganda kill children, tired of being seen as a monster by people he was trying to help. When Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast aired on August 15, 1945, Morrison was still on Okinawa, part of the occupation force securing the island and providing aid to the civilian population. He heard the news and felt a complicated mixture of relief and residual tension. Relief that the war was over, that he would not have to participate in the invasion of Japan that he knew would dwarf Okinawa's horrors. But tension because he understood that military surrender was only the first step. The psychological surrender, the deprogramming of an entire population that had been taught to fear and hate Americans, would take much longer. The occupation of Japan, beginning in September 1945 under General Douglas MacArthur's administration, was a test of whether the propaganda could truly be overcome. Could former enemies become partners in rebuilding a shattered nation? Could people who had been taught that Americans were demons come to see them as humans? Could the women in caves who had refused rice because they thought it was poisoned eventually accept that they had been lied to? The answer, remarkably, was yes. The American occupation of Japan was not perfect. There were incidents of violence, crimes committed by occupation forces, tensions between liberators and occupied. But compared to what could have happened, compared to what the propaganda had promised, the occupation was characterized by relative restraint and genuine efforts at reconstruction. American forces provided massive food aid to prevent starvation during the difficult winter of 1945-1946. The occupation government implemented democratic reforms, including a new constitution that limited the emperor to a symbolic role, guaranteed civil liberties, granted women the right to vote, and renounced war as an instrument of national policy. Land reforms broke up the old feudal estates. Educational reforms removed militaristic indoctrination from schools. War crimes trials held leaders accountable for their decisions while avoiding collective punishment of the Japanese people. Slowly, the propaganda's hold weakened. Japanese civilians discovered that American soldiers were not demons but young men far from home, often kind to children, sometimes clumsy with cultural differences, but generally well-intentioned. The food Americans provided was not poisoned but nourishing. The democratic reforms, while imposed by occupation authority, offered freedoms that many Japanese, particularly women and the working class, had never experienced under the imperial system. The transformation was not instantaneous. Trust took time to build. Older generations who had lived through decades of imperial propaganda found it harder to adjust than younger people who were more adaptable. Okinawans, who had suffered disproportionately during the war, maintained complicated feelings about the American military presence that would persist for generations. But the transformation did happen. Within a generation, Japan evolved from America's most hated enemy to one of its closest allies. The economic miracle of the 1950s and 1960s turned a devastated nation into an industrial powerhouse. Cultural exchange replaced military conflict. The women who had hidden in caves in 1945, terrified of American monsters, lived to see their grandchildren study in American universities, watch American movies, and build lives in a peaceful, prosperous Japan that the propaganda had never predicted could exist. Some of these women were interviewed in later decades, their stories preserved by historians and peace museums. Their accounts were consistent in describing the terror they had felt, the absolute conviction that American capture meant torture and death, and the slow, difficult process of unlearning the lies they had been taught. One woman, interviewed in 1987, recalled the moment she first accepted food from an American soldier. "I was certain I would die," she said. "I was certain he would kill me, probably after doing terrible things. But my daughter was starving. I could see her dying." So I took the rice he offered. I ate it expecting poison. When nothing happened, when he smiled and offered more, I felt my entire understanding of the world crack. Everything I had been taught was a lie. That realization was almost as painful as the hunger had been. Morrison returned to the United States in 1946, settling in Oregon. He married, had children, and worked in construction. For decades, he rarely spoke about his war experiences. The memories were too painful, too complicated. How do you explain to people who weren't there what it felt like to be seen as a monster? How do you describe the horror of watching propaganda kill children? But in the 1970s and 1980s, as historians began conducting more systematic interviews with World War II veterans, Morrison agreed to share his story. His accounts, preserved in the U.S. Marine Corps Historical Center archives, focused heavily on the cave encounters, particularly the June 18th incident that had shocked him so deeply. In a 1983 interview, Morrison reflected on what had surprised him most about the war. "I expected combat to be hell," he said, "and it was. I expected to see men die. I did. I expected to be afraid. I was. But I never expected to stand outside a cave, offering food to starving people and have them refuse because they thought I was going to kill them. I never expected propaganda to be more powerful than hunger. That shocked me more than any battle." The interviewer asked Morrison what he had learned from the experience. "I learned that if you control what people believe, you control everything they do. Those women in the cave, they loved their children. That wasn't the propaganda talking. That was real. But the propaganda had twisted that love into a weapon. It made them think the most loving thing they could do was refuse food and let their kids die. That's power. Terrifying power. And it made me understand that winning the war wasn't just about defeating the Japanese military. It was about defeating the lies that the Japanese military had told its people." Morrison died in 1991 at the age of 67. His obituary mentioned his service in the Pacific Theater but didn't detail specific incidents. His family knew some of the stories but not all of them. Only the archived interviews preserved the full account of what he had witnessed and how it had shaped his understanding of war, propaganda, and human nature. The cave where Morrison had offered food to terrified women still exists in southern Okinawa. It's not marked as a historical site. There are too many such caves, too many locations where similar scenes unfolded, for each to be individually commemorated. But the broader history is preserved in Okinawa's peace museums, in memorial parks, in monuments to civilian victims of the battle. Modern Okinawa is peaceful, prosperous, and popular with tourists who come for beautiful beaches and rich cultural heritage. The island still hosts American military bases, a continuing source of complicated feelings among Okinawans who remember the war and its aftermath. The relationship between Okinawa and the American military presence remains complex, mixing gratitude for the post-war reconstruction, resentment over continuing occupation, and pragmatic acceptance of geopolitical realities. But the peace is real. The children and grandchildren of the women who hid in caves grow up without the propaganda that poisoned their ancestors' minds. They learn history in schools that teach critical thinking rather than nationalist indoctrination. They have access to information from around the world, making comprehensive propaganda campaigns much harder to sustain in an age of global communication. The lesson of Morrison's shock, of those hours spent eating rice outside a cave while terrified women watched, resonates beyond World War II. Propaganda remains a powerful force in human affairs. Authoritarian regimes still use information control to shape populations' beliefs and behaviors. Democracies still struggle with misinformation, disinformation, and the challenge of maintaining shared factual understanding in fragmented media environments. The women in the cave chose rice because it was familiar, chose bread because it seemed safe, chose peaches for their children because sweetness suggested nurture rather than poison. But the real choice they made was not about food preferences. The real choice was to question, even slightly, the propaganda that had governed their understanding of reality. The real choice was to consider the possibility that the monsters they feared might be humans offering help. That choice, repeated thousands of times across Okinawa and millions of times across Japan during the occupation, transformed enemies into partners and war into peace. The choice was not easy. It required confronting the fact that authority figures had lied, that the emperor was not divine, that dying for honor might be dying for nothing. It required accepting food from hands that were supposed to torture, trusting faces that were supposed to kill, believing promises that were supposed to be traps. But enough people made that choice. Enough women took the rice. Enough children accepted the milk. Enough elderly civilians decided that survival might not equal dishonor. And slowly, meal by meal, day by day, the lies that had nearly destroyed a nation were replaced by the complicated, difficult, but ultimately more hopeful truth. Morrison's question, "How do you fight an enemy who's convinced you're a monster?" found its answer not in military tactics but in patient demonstration. You eat the rice you offer. You wait. You prove through actions, not words, that the propaganda was lying. You give people time to overcome years of indoctrination. You accept that some will never be convinced, that some have been too damaged by the lies to recover, but that others will eventually choose truth over terror. The shock Morrison felt outside that cave on June 18, 1945, was the shock of understanding how completely information warfare could triumph over reality. But the hope that eventually emerged was the hope that reality, given enough time and evidence, could eventually triumph over lies. 70 years after those events, the tin cans and rice bags have long since rusted away. The women who refused and then accepted food are mostly gone, their stories preserved in archives and memories. The Marines who offered food with patient determination have passed into history. But the lesson remains. Propaganda can make mothers watch their children starve, but demonstration and time can break propaganda's power. Lies can create monsters where none exist, but truth, patiently offered, can restore humanity to those who thought it lost. That is what shocked Private First Class James Morrison on a June afternoon in Okinawa. Not that hungry people chose rice over Spam, or that they preferred familiar foods to foreign ones, but that propaganda had so completely poisoned their minds that they chose nothing at all, choosing death over the help being offered by hands they had been taught to fear. And that is what gives hope in the decades since, that eventually, slowly, with patience and demonstration, those same people chose to eat, chose to trust, chose to question the lies they had been taught, and chose to build peace where war had convinced them only monsters dwelled. If this story opened your eyes to a side of history you've never heard before, help us share these untold moments by hitting that subscribe button. Every subscription tells us you want more real stories that challenge what we think we know about the past. Did Morrison's patient act of eating rice outside that cave move you? Show your support by clicking the like button. It helps this story reach others who need to understand how propaganda can twist even a mother's love into something deadly. And here's where your voice matters. Drop a comment below telling us what shocked you most about this story. Was it the women's refusal, the infant's tragic death, or the way simple food became the bridge between enemies? Your perspective adds to the conversation and helps us all learn from history's most powerful lessons. Don't let this story end here. Subscribe, like, and comment, because the past has more to teach us than we ever imagined.